Hello, everybody. Welcome to Orbit's series on writing your first SFF novel. And we're here with creating otherworldly cultures. And I'm Lauren Penapinto. I'm the creative director of Orbit. We're, um, taking turns moderating this panel. And this was definitely a panel I wanted to moderate, not only because of the amazing authors that are on it, but because as a person involved in cover design, I'm really interested in those otherworldly cultures that are created because it's part of my job to reflect that on the covers as much as possible. So before we get into that, I wanted to introduce our panel. And we have Ann Leckie, is the Hugo Nebula and Arthur C. Clarke award-winning author of Ancillary Justice and the rest of the Imperial Ratch series, as well as several other science fiction and fantasy novels, most recently Translation State. Suyi Davies Okungbowa is the author of the Nameless Republic series, which began with Son of the Storm and continues next month with Warrior of the Wind and several other fantasy novels, including some for young readers. Essa Hansen is the author of the Graven science fiction series, which began with No Fret Gloss. Davinia Evans is the author of the Burnished City series, which began with Notorious Sorcerer and continues next month with Shadow Baron. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for giving your time to all the new and soon to be authors in the group. I know there's also some artists who have told me that they're listening in on this series, so they will also be future cover designers or current cover illustrators, things like that. We're going to start off, this is a panel about otherworldly cultures and creating those cultures. First, can you talk a little bit about one or more of the cultures in your books that don't exist in the real world? What's distinctive about them? What kind of setting did they develop in? Anne, why don't we start with you and we can go around?
Okay, probably the obvious one is the Raj, which I did steal some things from the real world. I frequently steal things from the real world, but it's not just the Roman Empire with serial numbers filed off, or just whoever with the serial numbers filed off. But I did definitely construct it out of real world elements because, I mean, in some ways, whatever I can think of is probably something that's already happened. And the real world is just far more real than the way my mind would put things together from just the things that I already know. So I'm a big believer in looking carefully at the real world to construct things, to construct other cultures.
Cool. Davinia, how do you feel about that in your series?
Um, yeah, very much. The anything I can think of, probably someone else has already thought of and tried it in a few different ways. Um, in my Burnished City trilogy, it's set in the city of Bezim, which is a sort of independent city-state republic, very much in the sort of mold of Italian city-states or Venice. But it is also the only place in the world where you can reach the other planes of existence. So people within Bezim can open a gate to the empyreal plane or the ethereal plane or the abyssal plane and get material from the plants and the creatures and the people who live there to make magical effects in the mundane plane. And all of it is really just a mash of real things that I put together in slightly different ways.
Okay. I know, and I mean, I've read everybody's books in this panel, so I can say that it sounds like you're saying that there's a lot of stuff in the world, but from an outside coming in, it feels so unique, and everybody's feels so unique and so inventive. And obviously, there's touch points. Essa, how do you respond? Oh, you're still muted. Oh, weird. No. Okay. Suyi, why don't you go and we'll get Essa's audio working.
Sure. Hi. I was thinking about this when you asked, and I realized, similar to what Anne said, while I draw very deeply from existing cultures, specifically. So Bassa is the culture I was thinking of, which is the main city in the Nameless Republic trilogy, where everything is centered, sort of a city-state / empire. And I drew a lot from the Benin Empire of the Middle Age, Middle Age Benin Kingdom in West Africa. And one of the things I found is that even though I started from there, I ended up sort of really doing a lot of things by not just pulling in from other places and like adding those, but also like adding completely fictional elements to it. And I think what tends to drive the way I think of that is less about, am I really particularly, representing a very specific facet of the real world culture that I'm drawn from, but rather whether it is plausible within within this world that I've built. I like to think of geography a lot, and how like the physical influences the social, right? Like folks say clothing, but I often think, will that protect them from the elements? Like I think more in that sense, like, why do we develop certain kinds of clothing? Why do we prefer colors over, more drab clothing? Why do we prefer certain foods to keep us, longer? Why do we prefer certain activities that keep us indoors versus outdoors? Why do we do the opposite? I feel like these things often can be shaped a lot more from the world they're building while drawing from somewhere else. So I usually have a starting point. In this case, Bassa was from the Benin Kingdom, but then I ended up drawing like things from other empires that existed within the time, but also outside of the time. I even drew from contemporary, like the contemporary world. But at the same time, I was also extrapolating stuff from the city of Bassa itself. Like if the city shaped XYZ, how would people move? Why would they make this choice of this beast of burden over that beast of burden, and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it tends to be very iterative in that sense. I don't really do I've built a world, in full shape. Typically, I start from somewhere, typically a real world place, and then I become additive in a way. And what the final thing you see in the book is really me just asking questions and answering them until I get to the end of the book, and then that becomes the world.
Okay, cool. It seems like we've lost Essa for a moment. Hopefully she can rejoin with the audio intact, and we'll let her catch up when she gets here. So we were talking about what are related to the real world. Everything, of course, we're inspired a little bit by the real world. When you're using those real life inspirations, especially from existing human cultures, how do you work to avoid falling into stereotypes or cliches or things like that? So if you want to continue, because you were just talking about how closely you were pulling from real world cultures.
Sure. I guess what I typically do to start with is, and I guess it possibly helps that I tend to be quite loose in my planning. Like I have more of like scaffolding typically, right, for the world, but also for plot. And then I tend to sort of follow what, as I said, extrapolate from what is already on the ground. I think that already sort of defies stereotype, but if you follow it true to the world that's built. But even if, even when sometimes I find that I am asking questions and I'm not getting answers, and it can therefore be easy to fall into stereotype, what I tend to do is ask myself why this even needs to be like, a specific representation of a specific thing. Does it need to be that thing? It's always a question I think it's good to ask. Like, does it need to be this exact thing? What are you really trying to do with this, people, culture, right? If the idea, for instance, is to have, the idea of I guess like a one note representation of a thing, a warring race, for instance, the question is, does such a thing even exist? Like if you look at our real world, does the idea of a warring race really exist? And does there need to be a representation of a warring race? Maybe what you actually need is to just simply have an antagonist, which is fine if that antagonist is one person or a group of people, but not a whole race, maybe. So in that sense, I'm always like, ask the core question of what you're actually trying to do, wherein typically the stereotype is just a shortcut to do the thing. So if you ask the right question, you can get to the thing and then address that thing rather than use the stereotype, which sort of leads to the point, I guess, that's my like overall guiding principle, being that it is very hard, and I think you can see this in the real world, to actually say this is representative of, whatever group. Impossible. Even if there's like an overarching brush we can sort of paint a group with, it is the chances that doesn't apply to everyone are like much higher than the chances that they do. So therefore, I always ask myself, rather than say this is who these people are, the question is, who is this person? Who is, what is this place? Who is this person, right? Be specific and see if there are actually opportunities for deviation from, what is presented. And often there will be, especially by way of like narrative opportunities that you find in the narrative. It is likely that there will be an opportunity, and if there is one, I tend to take it just to provide that opportunity for deviation, to say this doesn't need to be representative of everything, even if it has facets of whatever you want. Yeah.
Thank you, Essa. Did we get you back?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. Okay, good.
We can.
Everything works until it doesn't, right?
Okay, well, I'm gonna put a pause in the stereotype question and come back to it. Essa, do you want to give us a little bit of background on the cultures in your book and where they were inspired from?
Yeah, so the world in my trilogy is a vast multiverse made up of bubble-shaped individual universes that all have their own kind of physical laws. So the cultures and the creatures and the species that develop in those universes are going to be unique to, whatever those parameters are. But instead of going deep into any one culture, the point of the story is this sort of overarching culture of, coming together and exploration and economy, and exploring like how these many, many different species across different galaxies kind of commingle. And that meant that I had to make it seem like there was that depth in each culture, even if it's just an alien passing by or one we spend a little time with, or there are several aliens on the found family crew. But each of them needed to feel like it had all of that depth and development, even if it was just kind of passing by. So it was my big culture challenge.
Yeah, you really bit off a big chunk of the world building. Like you went for an extra helping or 10 of world building in your books than most SFF authors do.
In some ways, it's easier not to have to put in all that time to develop the back end of these creatures and cultures, but it's a unique challenge in its way to make it appear like that's not there. The cowboy.
Yeah, and also to give the illusion. Also to give the not the illusion of depth, but the feeling of depth, even though you're just, like you said, you just see some characters for just like a little bit.
Yeah, and focusing on the feeling, like what I want the reader to feel when they see this, focusing on emotion and feeling, and the features that will convey that are still have a sense of realism and grounding with familiar stuff. It's awesome. Tricky balance.
Cool. Well, the question you missed that we're going to go back to now was how do you, especially when you're working with things that are kind of more directly inspired by human things or things we know, how do you not fall back on stereotypes, which is a question Suyi was answering. I think Anne was ready to jump in on. So why don't you go ahead?
I actually kind of wanted to expand on something Suyi said, because I think Suyi's answer was really good. And a lot of times when you look at your own surrounding culture, be it a microculture of like your neighborhood and your family or whatever, and you say, well, we're really complicated and we have all these divisions and differences and people are very different and different opinions. But that group over there, they're not, because I can see them. They're very monolithic, right? It's a really common, because you don't know them as well. And so my advice to folks wanting to avoid the stereotypes is to stop and say everybody feels that way about their own culture, right? Their own group. They know the incredible complexity of their own group. You don't know the incredible complexity of the other group. That's one of the big dangers when you say, I'm going to take ancient Japan and file off the serial numbers, and you're not Japanese. It's not necessarily, you don't know it intimately enough to see where it's not monolithic. And so it's important to ask yourself, as Suyi says, all right, I'm seeing this group as one big warrior race. There is no one big warrior race. So how would they look like a warrior race from the outside, but how do they really live, right? And in a lot of ways, the simplest way to say it, but it's maybe not helpful, is remember that everybody's human, right? Nobody is just a blank lockstep paper doll that's just doing whatever the anthropologist says everybody in that culture does. But how do you do that? You have to remember that everybody's experience of their surroundings is very deep and full of nuance and full of contradiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Dee, do you want to jump in? You don't have, nobody has to jump in on every question. I'm just making sure everybody gets a chance.
I like this idea of the individual and the monolith. I think even within our own cultures, we tell stories about, like a society is in a way a collective story that we're telling about our identity, but everyone within that society is interacting with that monolithic identity in their own ways. So, I mean, I'm Australian. Some myths about Australians: we drink a lot, we swear a lot, we have problems with authority, we're all good at sport. And like, obviously those don't apply to every single individual in Australia. We're all interacting with these concepts in various ways. And anytime we're thinking about another culture that we want to draw from, or even just a culture that we're building, I think it's important to think about the group, but also the individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Essa, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like if you're lifting an entire culture or Earth thing and just filing those serial numbers off, you're gonna get in trouble. Like you can't. And I think a lot of authors fall into this trap because it's easier to like take a whole thing that's already fully formed, that's familiar to the readers, and make it a little bit different. You do that too many times, then you don't. You just have Earth. And it is tricky to, like, the reverse end of that is, absolutely everything in this world is new. The language, the terms for everything is new. All of you can't go that far either. So trying to strike that balance between, a world that's grounded and has enough familiar elements that, maybe we've experienced or, we've learned about to ground the reader and make the weird stuff and the fun stuff and the imaginative stuff palatable and, able to be grasped. Versus going too far. It's a tricky balance. I think that's where a lot of authors get in trouble, is they're trying too much to keep it grounded and to like copy paste pieces to help themselves along and to help buoy the stranger pieces.
Yeah. Is there a way in for each of you that, either that you go to all the time, like, is it, some authors I've spoken to, it's like the actual anatomy of what that, we're talking, if it's an alien race or something, do they have different anatomy or something like that? Some people it's more, rituals or holidays or cultural things. Some people it's been music. Did each of you kind of, was there a spark or a thing that got you started imagining this culture that then blossomed out into this world? Was there or is there one kind of go-to that you always think of first? Anybody can. I know this is a thinker, so anybody can jump in.
Sorry, I didn't actually quite catch the question. Could you repeat it?
So, I think my question is, what was the thing that sparked your world building? Like, where did you start from? Like, is it costume? Is it music? Is it anatomy? Again, in an alien kind of species? Is it architecture? Is it weather? Anything like that? Do you guys remember?
It's hard to remember. I will often go with anthropology and history. Boy, history is full of wonderful things. As long as you're not going for the, well, I shouldn't say this. You should write whatever you want. If you really feel called to write, what if the Nazis won World War II? If that's really what your soul desires you to write, then that's what you should write. But I would advise looking into all kinds of history is huge. There's so many things. And I love that Suyi mentioned geography, because geography is so important and determines things like weather, right? And a lot of my fantasy stories, once I had my core, I was doing all kinds of geography stuff to figure out what was going on with those cultures. It can be anything, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of maps in fantasy. I think there should be more maps in sci-fi. I'm just going to put that out there. I think as the person that handles the maps, I think there should be more maps in sci-fi. How about anybody else? What were you inspired by to start world building?
Do you mind if I go?
Go.
Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah. I don't
want to be too rigid, but I mean, I'll step in, but I don't want to, I'll moderate if I have to, but feel free to convert.
Mine was, I think, architecture, because I think I really had, I think, a very firm idea of what I wanted the city to look like, cobbled together from some of it imagination, some of it an actual representation of the city, the empire I was drawing from. But also part of it was also like thinking about where this kind of city will be situated geographically in the world that I've built. So sort of like finding, and so it was a mixture between the layout of the city itself, what will be where, why will it be there, where will other things be in relation to the city, and then to think about the layout of what the housing looked like externally, in the sense like what would it be built with, what would people in this area consider a lasting material, what would they have access to based on, so a good example is like Bassa is in a, sort of like a rainforested area, so the housing would therefore reflect that, in the sense that they would build higher off the ground, they would have more wooden material, etc. And then I thought about the spaces between, which is how I like to think about it. Like, okay, so there's the housing, but like, how do the spaces outside of that, like between these spaces, function? How do the roads function, corridors, yards, marketplaces, town squares or city squares? The city is actually split into wards, the way we have neighborhoods, and so it's like, what does each ward represent? Like, why are some richer, why are some poorer? So that was literally, I think, where it started for me. And then once I figured that out, it was easy to think about. If you thought about a character, you would know where they would fit, because then you say, okay, if they fit here, then they would move through society in this way, and they would, navigate this world that way. So that would even like influence how they think about decisions when faced with dilemmas, etc. So for me, character tends to spring from place, and imagining place like that really helped cement the story itself, not just the world.
Cool. Essa, what do you think?
I can jump in. Yeah. So my ideas usually start from something really small, something from nature or something from science that I find really interesting. And then, like Suyi was describing, you sort of press at it with different questions, and you keep asking questions of it and keep asking questions, and then that little seed of inspiration grows. And so, like, for example, some of the aliens in my multiverse have skin that's built of chromatophores, which are like color-changing cells, kind of like pixels. And cephalopods, like cuttlefish on Earth, have these, and their body changes with different patterns and colors. So, we have an alien that communicates in this manner, and involuntarily their emotions are shown upon their skin. Like whatever they're feeling and thinking is exterior to them, and they don't always have control over that. So taking that kind of interesting idea and then, well, what does that mean for this? What does that mean for this? How do they react? And just pushing questions at it until it becomes a bigger thing. That's
cool. Awesome. Dee? What do you think?
Yeah, very much sort of starting with that kernel and then pushing it out. I often start with vibes and cool. It's like, what do I think would be fun? But then you sort of hold that and you go, okay, so if this, what does that then imply? What does this need to hold it up? And what does this then cause to be upon the world? So I knew that I wanted to have the city of Bazim literally split in half. There'd been a giant earthquake and it had split the city in half. There's a great big cliff in the middle now. So I'm like, okay, that implies a larger than usual social division between literally the upper city and the lower city. But also it means that something has caused this. So there's this force of magic or something like that. But also I just knew that I wanted to have people running around having sword fights all over the place. So I'm like, okay, now we've got the sort of culture that doesn't mind and in fact loves just having sword fights breaking out as entertainment. It's sort of like sport. It's sort of like, so these are things that I just start with because I think they're cool, but then they have much larger repercussions for the entire culture. And it all sort of needs to feel homogenous, and you need to massage it to all come together and feel good.
That is fun. Yeah, like picking something and then having to almost not justify it within your own world.
You build
but kind
around
of like,
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I think that the next place I would like to go, and we don't have a completely even split. We have two very fantasy worlds, and then Essa has written science fiction, and you've done both, although you're known more for science fiction. I love Raven Tower, so I'm not going to say that you're not a fantasy author, but for the sake of an even split, we'll say sci-fi for you. Is there? Do we think there's a difference between sci-fi world building and fantasy world building? Is it where you start? Is there no difference? How do y'all feel about it?
I don't tend to think there's a huge difference between the two. I know there are people who would, be pistols at dawn about that. But I think that even if they may have started out differently, the same authors have written both for so long, and they've been, people have played with mixing them together for so long that they're really largely indistinguishable, in my opinion. And the world building isn't that different for me, having done both. I don't know how anybody else feels, but that's my take on it.
Well, let's find out how everybody else feels.
Certainly, the more I thought about this question, the more I felt like, yeah, you can probably do anything you want in either setting. It's just how you build the idea and what underpins it and how it comes out. So I was thinking you can have strange races of humanoid beings in space through other planets. You can have them in fantasy through other planes, other realms, other whatever. You can have them through genetic engineering by science or magic. You can probably find a way to do whatever you want, wherever you want it. It's just about building it and making it feel strong and natural in whatever way.
Yeah, I think it's mostly an aesthetic choice.
I think of science fiction and fantasy not just in terms of world building, but in the way we perceive genre as different paths to answering questions. Because really, when we're trying to tell stories, right, we have questions about the world that we're trying to address, and we take different paths to doing that. And I think science fiction and fantasy are just different kinds of paths, but they tend to follow the same way of thinking, if I should put it that way. It's about what possibilities exist for this thing to answer this question that I have about the world, or about this story, about the world of this story. And then sometimes the answer to that is magic, and sometimes the answer to that is technology, and sometimes the answer to that is technology that looks like magic, or magic that looks like technology. And so in a way, I tend to think of it more like as a spectrum, but like that spectrum is still the same. The one where we sort of try to pose questions and try to answer them, and the spectrum contains many paths.
Yeah, I agree. The the spirit and the process behind the two is the same, but sometimes they have different tools. So like, see, you mentioned technology and science fiction. Technology is a tool that we can use to explore our culture. Like, does that alien culture have its own technology? What does that look like? What does it allow it to do? Does it help us communicate? And a lot of stories are humans discovering alien technology and doing probably irresponsible things with it. And in science fiction, like first contact stories is a whole subgenre. Because people have always been fascinated with extraterrestrial life and what that would look like, and what the meeting of those two cultures would look like. So in first contact science fiction, is exploring at the depth of one culture usually, and whether that's aliens on Earth or they're not in space or on their planet, it's a whole subgenre. And in hard science fiction, you're world building within the constraints of science to the degree that we understand it today. And in those constraints, there's limitations. There's some things you can't do. But constraints push you to ingenuity in new ways. So it's both a challenge and like a fun space.
Yeah, and I'm never going to be able to quote this perfectly, but at the edges of how we understand science. I mean, there are plenty of actual scientists writing science fiction, but at some point, my understanding of physics might as well be magic. I think Terry Pratchett was the one that said, if as the technology gets more and more not understandable by the lay person, it becomes kind of magic.
Are you thinking of one of Clarke's laws, which is sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? Yeah. And I feel very strongly that sufficiently comprehensible magic is indistinguishable from technology. So it becomes a question of where you want the reader or the characters to stand in terms of how they see how their world operates. So it's not a question of, so you can make all the rules, right? If your folks are doing research and very carefully understanding their magic, that's a technology and they're doing science. If you've got somebody picking up alien technology that you push a button and amazing things happen and they don't know how, that might as well be magic. And that's part of why I think science fiction and fantasy are more about where you're positioning the sort of view of the world than about any inherent difference about technology or magic.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because having read Dee's book, the first one, Notorious Sorcerer, the way the magic is handled in that, it's very alchemy based, but it feels like science to the folks in the book, really, even though it's planes and things like that. We could be talking about string theory and in physics as opposed to.
If it's valid in that world, then it is science that they're doing, and it is technology that they're doing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, no, I'm the moderator. You guys are the meat and potatoes of this conversation.
I was also gonna say that a lot of it too can seem the same thing that we're presenting can also be viewed differently by different people. So it's some of it is also dependent on like where the POV is coming from. I mean, I remember going to this black hole show at the planetarium, and it just looked like, I was like, what is this freaky thing? That could easily be magic to anyone who has never heard of black holes before. Is it science? Obviously it is, but at the same time, it's kind of like really, really magic-y. Even regular stuff like a cell phone, you take it far back enough and it's magic, really. So and so even in your world, right, when you create this thing and you say, well, this is science fiction, but it can be interpreted differently depending on the society that's looking at it and whom and where, where the POV is centered, what POV is being centered by the narrative itself. And so again, as I said, I like to think on that spectrum a lot. I'm like, this thing can exist and it can have a scientific explanation for it, but it can also be very much magic because, like, for some people, no thing should be able to do that, and therefore it's magic. So.
Yeah, there's a lovely recent novella by Adrian Tchaikovsky called Elder Race, which is 2 points of view in the same world, and there's ancient technology that's sort of gone through the ages, but the colony there does not understand it. To them, it's magic. All the technology in this world is magical, and their perspective and their worldview and their language for these things is very fantastical. And then you have another character who's like from the original college that created all of this technology and knows the mechanics of it, and knows the real names for it, and is very science based. And these two characters relating to each other and kind of meeting between these very different worldviews in a world that's the same. They had the same experiences and very different perspectives on it. It's really interesting.
Oh, that's cool. I have to check that one out. I haven't read that one yet. But yeah, that sounds like the embodiment of this debate. Since this is a series about helping people write their first or second or third sci-fi novel, I'm going to bring it back to some more grounded author kind of housekeeping. Once you start world building, how do you keep track? Like, what are the tools you use to keep track of what you've built, either book to book or the in the background, so that you don't do you build a reference sheets for yourself, depending on whether it's science fiction, fantasy, whatnot? How do you keep yourself consistent? I mean, Suyi, there's been a lot of comments I've been watching. Everybody's very interested in that board next to you, but all of you, how do you keep track of yourselves so you're not accidentally contradicting yourself?
Are those posted, Suyi?
They're actually 5x6s, or anyway, they're just cut up.
Are they tacked up, I guess?
Yeah, they're just tacked up with like tape. So, but this is narrative stuff. This is not world building stuff. My world building stuff I do in Notion.
In Notion?
In Notion. I use Notion for world building now. I didn't always use Notion. What I used to do was, so at the start, I just had, sheets in a file, really, like anyone. I would print stuff out and just like file it in a binder. But then that got old real fast. And I said, okay, I started an internal website, actually. So I used Google Sites for a while, but you could pretty much just do that with anything. You just don't make the site public. And it was easy because I could just add pages. I could just have, stuff with links and all of that. And so I was like, quote unquote, making my own wiki. But then I got concerned about not being able to like download everything. Or like lose everything if I lost that. And so what I started doing was I decided to move it into something more internal and something that I could have backups. So, and now I just moved to Notion because Notion works across devices. So like if I think of something, I can just open up my phone and like quickly add it and it update everywhere. But yeah, something that gives me sort of like ease of adding is really what I favor. But yeah, and so for a while as well, I used Google Docs because of that, because I was sure that I could easily add everywhere. And for me, it's always that, because I'm always thinking of like, this is a thing that should exist in my world, and I'll just put it somewhere. And then later I'll figure out where it actually fits. But yeah, that's really that's how I keep track now. I have my own internal wiki, whether I'm using Notion or I'm using any other piece of software.
There's also, it's free, it may still be out there, TiddlyWiki. And you download TiddlyWiki and it's your own little wiki that you can keep like on your desktop or wherever. And I actually have a TiddlyWiki, but I haven't used it for a while. It's a really good cat vacuuming technique, where you don't want to write. So I have to update my TiddlyWiki and make it all beautiful and add entries, right? If anybody has the luxury of this, chalkboard paint is the best thing in the world. I painted this whole wall with chalkboard paint. And when I have names or stuff that I have to like not forget, I chalk it up on the wall. And then when I'm done with the project, I erase it all. It's the best thing in the world. Other than that, I tend to write my first drafts in Scrivener, which I really enjoy. Not everybody likes it, but I really like it. And so I keep a document in Scrivener with important notes so that I'm like, wait a minute, what was the name of that space station? And I can go look at the document list of space stations. And I'm like, oh, I see. Okay. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as complicated as you want. It can be super simple.
Awesome.
Yeah, I use Scrivener also. And for me, it's like just a folder hierarchy, and I can organize things in there. I use it really simply. But having everything in one document is great, and having split screen is great. So I have, documents for alien races and locations and all the kind of research stuff broken out as much as I want to break it out in there.
Cool. Dee, how do you keep track of all that alchemy?
My first thought on this question was, shit, I wish I kept track of everything. Because I basically wrote the first draft in just a flurry of creativity, and I just put in whatever I thought was cool. And then, like, when I wanted to get serious about it, and certainly when I had to do books 2 and 3, it's like, now I'm going to remember what I called that thing and how this works. And so at that point, I started organizing things in Scrivener, and I had pages on, all the Bravi, the sword gangs, and who they were and what their little defining features were, and other parts of my city and my culture. But that was very much an after the fact thing. I did a lot of my world building on the fly, and then I had to try and codify it. And I was still catching things in copy edit stage and going, oh yeah, that doesn't link up there anymore. But yeah, I organize in Scrivener now.
Yeah.
Because I write in Scrivener, it's handy to just have it right there.
Yeah. I also did a lot of world building on the fly, especially in a story setup where a lot of the aliens are kind of come in as I need them and serve a specific function in the story. And then, maybe we're not visiting them again, or they're in background. So I can write until I come up to the spot where, okay, I need a creature here. I need like a creature here. And then pause and do all that work and then put it in. But now that my trilogy is finished, I feel like I need to go back, and all that stuff that only exists in my brain that I didn't have any need to put into Scrivener, I should do my due diligence and write it all out.
I mean, if you want to, and there's totally nothing wrong for all the writers out there who haven't done their first novel or are coming up to their second. There's nothing wrong with doing your world building on the fly. Absolutely nothing. I know a lot of folks will spend a lot of time building everything up before they write. And if that process works for you, by all means, do it. But I think a lot of people get bogged down in that. And so just do enough that you feel like you can move your character forward. And then when you get stuck, go to the library, go to the museum, read a geography text, go, do whatever it is. Don't feel bad about starting with almost nothing, because you can build as you go. You absolutely can.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're going to switch. Those are the questions that we had prepared. But I've been watching them get voted up. There's some great questions in the Q&A section. So I'm going to read out some of those. The one that's at the top and very highly voted. When creating otherworldly cultures, especially with hard world building, I don't know, hard world building versus soft world building, that's a different question. How do you ease your audience into the culture or world? How do you do you go for the info dumping, or do you avoid info dumping? Like, do you just like to drop people in the middle of it? Do you like to ease them into it? How do you guys kind of take that on? If anybody is inspired first, feel free to jump in.
So, I want to say first that for me personally, and I don't know about everybody else here, I think there's way too much stress on avoiding info dumps to new writers. There's nothing wrong with just telling your reader what they need to know. Absolutely nothing wrong. You just don't want it to be like slow and dull, and so you want to do your info dumps really well. You can start off, now I gather this is a question about beginnings. You can start with an info dump if your info dump is really gorgeous, super interesting, or very funny, right? Otherwise, I would strongly advise focusing really heavily on a character that you want your readers to follow, so that you spend some time close up on the details with the character, the reader gets hooked into the character, and then you can broaden out as the character interacts with the world. That's not the only way to do it, but that's a sort of a down and dirty way to do it. But if you have a really gorgeous info dump that's just amazingly fascinating, try it, open it up, see what your readers think.
Oh, great advice.
I think sometimes in beginnings, info dumping can be like the author's way of finding their way through the world, like almost authorial throat clearing. And it's okay to put that, like, get it all down. If you're exploring the world and how it feels to be there and how things work, you can always edit it back or find a better place for that. You refine your language around that thing. So it's totally fine in the beginning to like, maybe you do need to dump for yourself
Yeah.
and then shape it later.
The cool thing about writing is you can do that, right? Yeah. You can do anything on the page and then delete things and edit things and nobody knows you did that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. For my trilogy, I got to cheat because I had a ignorant character who started in a very isolated and intentionally like isolated, impoverished worldview with very little language about things, very little knowledge about things. And then he falls into a found family of multiversal explorers. And of course, they get to explain things to this young character, and the reader gets to follow along and sort of be fed information and be exposed to new environments as it feels more and more comfortable.
That's not cheating.
That's
not cheating at all.
Technique in the genre. Yeah. It's got a name. That's fish out of water, right? Mm-hmm. You can absolutely do fish out of water.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be the main character. It can be another character. It could be a situation. It could be, there's ways to show the world through character in that way.
I have I sort of have a couple of techniques that I tend to follow. The first one is very similar to what Anne said, which is I'm actually not against infodumps. I actually think they're fine. I guess the pushback typically tends to be that the info dumps are not doing one of two things. They're not interesting enough or they're not relevant. And so make the info dump relevant or interesting. And the relevance means that you should only offer, or you should offer what's needed when it's needed. And that's fine. If it needs to be lengthy, then it needs to be lengthy. But sometimes we want to be indulgent, which is also fine. I'm pro indulgence, okay? If you want your side quests or whatever, put that stuff in, but then it has to be interesting because otherwise it's just boring. So do info dumps, but they should be relevant or interesting. The other thing for me is that when in doubt, try to see if you can break it up with, so this is more of like a craft thing and less like a world building thing. Try to see if you can break up the stuff that needs to be told with what I think of as like sort of like pace accelerating choices. So a bit of dialogue here, some description of actual action in between. So like you have this chunk of info, it's fine, but can you break that up in a way that stuff will get moving? Sometimes when people think that things need to, quote unquote, get moving, they think actual action needs to happen on the page. But what actually needs to happen is the reading, the progression of the text, the textual progression needs to be moving. And sometimes what you do is you break that up with, you have description and then you have dialogue and you have some action, a few lines here, and then you go back to description. That will get stuff moving and it wouldn't feel like an info dump, even if it totally is. So that's my like fail safe. If I'm like, this info dump needs to happen, then I just, do the few tricks then. Yeah.
Sorry, my headphone fell out. It might be. Dee, did you want to speak to that or?
I'm very much just drop straight into the middle of the world. But as I think Anne said, like focusing on a character really allows you to explore because you can show what's normal for them. And if that's not normal for the reader, then that gives a good point of difference to it's normal for this character in this world. And that sort of starts the exploration. And you can do a lot of, you can give a lot of information quite quickly in that way, I think.
Plus, starting that way does a thing that part of, I really liked Suyi's comment about motion not being stuff happening on the page. A lot of times when people talk about suspense and they think of it in terms of the reader doesn't know what's going to happen next and I'm delaying it to happen and that's making suspense. But what makes suspense is the reader cares what happens next. And it's easier, for certain values of easier, to get the reader to care about a character. And once the reader cares about where the story is going, then you have a lot of freedom with what you're doing. You don't have to worry quite, I mean, you do have to, but you have to engage the readers caring about what's happening in the story, and you have to do that pretty much right up front. So there's a bunch of ways to do that, but a character is an easy way to do that. It's not easy, but
yeah, just write a character that everyone falls in love with and
right.
That's easy, right? No problem. Here's another highly rated question, which I think can get a little meta, but let's see how we do. How do you communicate otherworldliness to the reader when the otherworldliness is normal to the narrator or the main character? I know, it's a little mind-bending.
So I feel like I'm talking all the time. My approach is to just treat it like it's normal, because it will come across as otherworldly to the reader. Even if it's normal to the character will be like, oh yes, I had my talking pet turtle, of course, as everyone does. And the reader's going to go, that's weird. So if it's weird, you don't have to work to communicate the weirdness of it. That's kind of my take on it, but I know other folks probably have other ways of handling that.
Yeah, I think I lean on the characters, explaining through the character's normal experience of whatever that weird thing is. So like later in my series, I have a character who can essentially dislocate their consciousness into this other dimension and travel there, interact there, download their consciousness into another body, that sort of stuff. So what that world is and how those mechanics work, the reader comes to learn through just describing what that experience is like to her. Like, I don't stop the info dump. I don't try to over-explain how things work. You just find the moments to convey what that experience is like for the character, and the reader's gonna pick up and connect the dots and figure out how it functions.
I think that I think one other key thing is to ask if you're conveying that thing as otherworldly because you want to convey it as otherworldly, or if it's like important to be conveyed at all. This is to say, like, are you sort of describing that thing because you think, oh, this is otherworldly, I should therefore like put it in the frame of my story? It might not even be worth a mention ordinarily. Like, the idea, some things are very natural to us can be otherworldly to others, and I would expect them to be, but you don't. I guess this is to say, like, do you need to communicate otherworldliness is the real question. And
that's
typically,
a really good question.
Yeah, like, do you really need to do that? Possibly not. Possibly you're just communicating a thing that is a thing to the character. Especially if, as you say, it's normal to the narrator, then they wouldn't even.
Yeah, I think that's a super good question, and because, why are you trying to communicate otherworldliness?
And sometimes why we read is because we want to get into these worlds and feel like we live there, feel like it's normal, feel like we're part of that without it feeling other from us.
Cool. Sorry.
I was going to say a good, like, possibly a more practical option. If you really want to, there's something that you feel you need to convey to the reader, but you don't want to make a point of it because it would be ordinary in the world, you can dig into the details. So you don't so much talk about the talking, how the character has a talking pet turtle, but you have them talking to another character and going, oh, you do this with your pet turtle. Oh, I don't do that. I do that. And like getting into the nitty gritty of, the everyday little details of having a talking pet turtle that you don't actually say, oh, by the way, we have talking pet turtles.
Yeah, jumping back to the building on little things, you're like, well, my characters have talking pet turtles. How does that affect their daily life? Do you have to walk extra slow so your turtle can keep up with you?
But you have a little bag to carry them. Everyone has their turtle bag.
Yeah.
I want a turtle now. The takeaway from this panel is going to be everybody gets a pet turtle. Okay, here's another question. When writing otherworldly cultures, how much do you try to show that there is another unfamiliar language behind the prose in English or whichever real world language you're writing in? Some people get annoyed by having too many made up words in a text. Some people love that. What are strategies to handle language for those of you that have?
Sentence structure.
Okay.
or register. Register is a formality. And at this point, I'm not going to talk about my own work, but I'm going to talk about C.J. Cherry's foreigner books, which everyone needs to at least read the first one and decide if you like them, because they're just so good. But if you don't like them, it's okay. Nobody's perfect. But in those books, the characters speak either Mosfei, which is very clearly English, or Ragi, which is the language of the group of aliens who the main character interacts with. And it's almost always super clear when the main character is speaking Mosfei or speaking Ragi. It's really obvious. And it's obvious from the register, from a couple of English vocabulary words that are marked at the beginning as typical translations out of Ragi. And it works really, really well. And so for folks who are interested in that question, I strongly recommend reading Foreigner.
Cool. I'm going to read that too. You want to add that one yet?
I think for me, it tends to be, well, first of all, the syntax, right? So if I think it helps to listen to people who are speaking, who are multilingual, but also to think about how a language sounds in translation. Because, you know, a good example is like if I listen to someone say the same thing in French, if I translated that to English, you'd be like, oh, so you mean X. And what you're doing there is you're saying, you're saying what they have said. This is a simpler way to say it. But when you are writing in a text, you can actually think about how that language that you have imagined will be translated into English, and then write that. And it wouldn't really quite sound as, you know, it won't flow as much, especially in dialogue, right? Dialogue is a very good place to do this, where someone will speak English, but it will sound like someone is speaking English that has been passed through Google Translate or something. Not in a broken way, but like in a, this is correct, but an English speaker wouldn't say this type of that. So that's one way. The other way I tend to do it is when you have, and I know this is like sort of coming back to the question here about having made up words, it's about limiting made up words to words that actually don't have translations in English, like we have in many languages around the world, where they would say something and be like, I can't tell you what this means. If you have those words, slang, it doesn't even have to be slang, it can be like colloquial usage or just made up words to reference something and say, well, that just is something like blah, blah, blah. And so it's less of like putting it in the face of the reader every time, and more of like signaling to the reader every now and then that there's actually a language that is being spoken and being translated for you, the reader, in English. You just get to read the narration in English, and the dialogue and sometimes the narration will remind you every now and then that there is a language being spoken. So it's more about signals and using specific in translation manner of approach to deliver the language. I don't do that as much in the exposition itself, but I do that a lot in dialogue and in specific word choice.
Cool. So we're actually at time. This went so fast. I can't even believe it. There's been so much wonderful advice for folks who are working on world building, working on novels, but also just like a fascinating conversation to listen to. You know, I hear conversations about world building all the time, especially, like I said, in relation to maps and covers, but this has been great. Thank you so much for taking time out of your writing schedules to do this. Before we wrap up, I'm going to say there is a button for everybody watching at the bottom that links you right to the author's books, and you can sign up and see all the other sessions for this series, and the ones that have been recorded already are available to see. So check that out before this closes. But let's close with, has there been, this is a question, so we can mark it, but just, has there been any one piece of world building advice that you heard or that you would give to somebody that's, you know, struggling with world building, or maybe, you know, maybe they're plot people, maybe they're character people, world building is not their go-to. And then, you know, if you feel like plugging your book again, please feel free, read your books again, and then we'll wrap it up.
I guess I'll say in once again, incorporating things without info dumping, I saw the question flash up, is just walk your character through it. And when there's a detail that you have to explain, take a half a sentence and say, she was talking about her talking turtle. And then continue on, right? Don't worry too much. You will almost never lose by respecting your reader. Don't worry too much about your reader catching on things. And then you have your friends or whatever who read through and like, I don't understand this. Okay, then I can put more stuff in. But especially on your first draft, don't worry too much about how do I explain all of this. Just tell your story. And then go back and refine things later. And don't worry about info dumping. Don't worry about that at all. Just tell your story and you'll be okay.
Great advice.
If I was to say anything, I would say less is more is sort of what I tend to go with. Mm-hmm. You can interpret that in two ways. One of those is that you can actually start your story with less than you think. You don't actually need everything. The other is that sometimes going deeper is better than going wider. And so you might actually get more out of starting with the less and actually going, further down that specific path than actually attempting to have a wider view. So I would say typically that's how I tend to start my stories. And I would advise folks who want to work.
I'm going to jump in again and add that on the times that I have critiqued folks vary at the beginning of their writing journey, the biggest missteps that folks made at the beginning, they would have a fabulous world. It was clear that they had spent so much love and thought into building their world, but they open with a big, long dissertation about the history of their world or how the society works. And I'm like, you have thought so hard about this and it is so beautiful and you need to cut all of this and just toss us into the story and paste these other things in when we need them. Just drill down into your details and the wider stuff will come.
Yeah, it's always about my focus tends to be about the people, right? So like if you start with a person going through a specific problem, we will get to see the world anyway. So you'll get your chance to show us everything. But for now, you can actually start with figuring out what the problem that a character has that they need to address. And that's pretty much where stories kick off.
But also save that document. Don't delete delete it. Send it to your cover designers.
Don't delete anything. That's another thing I love about Scrivener. Don't delete anything. Put it in a little folder over to the side. Snapshot before you delete anything. Just keep it all. Keep it all. You'll use some of it. You'll refer back to it.
Yeah, the boneyard file. My advice would be to follow what's interesting to you and to have fun. Like, go down that research rabbit hole, like chase that little thing that you find interesting. Because if what you're putting on the page is boring to you, it's going to be boring to the reader. But if you're following and questioning and elaborating on things that you find really interesting, you will have fun in the process and it will show up on the page.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would echo that. Is have fun, do what you think is cool, get your vibes in. You can always smooth it out later. You really can.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panel for taking time out of their deadlines. I know some of you are on deadline. And thanks so much. And everybody, check out the links. And I'm gonna end this right now, or somebody's going to end this right now. Angela, who's running this, is going to end this right now. Thank you so much, and check out the other sessions in How to Write Your First SFF novel.